I feel like there's a generational divide, with you're talking about me and Stephen A's generation. I can't remember how old Max is, where we just assume we go through the rest of our life with Michael Jordan as the GOAT. But I think under 30 people who weren't there for it, they want their own guy. And I get it. That was one of the reasons I wrote my basketball book 10 years ago, because, I think every generation wants to have their guy. They think their guys were more meaningful than the guys before them. I think in this case, with this documentary, it's reestablishing the resume that he has, which, it's not just the 6 finals. It's the force of personality. It's just how amazing he was, especially the first three-peat versus the second three-peat, how his game evolved. And you think hey, the only guy I can really compare him to is Ali, where you have Muhammad Ali in the 60s, the guy who fought Cleveland Williams, people like that, was so incredible and so athletically superior. And then the guy who ended up in the mid-70s fighting, Foreman, Frazier the third time. It's more smarts, it's more know-how, it's more guile. He had to dip into a different reservoir of tricks. And I think that's what cemented him those last 2 years, which are going to be what's in episode 9 and 10 on Sunday night. Those last 2 years, when we already thought he was probably the best player we were ever going to see. And then he has these double exclamation points in 97 and 98. And that clinched it. And I still feel that way. I think it's still clinched.
Bill Simmons, we all know that you love your Boston Celtics. They were a part of this docuseries. We saw how the Detroit Pistons, we saw that story about how the Detroit Pistons and, when they talked about Isaiah walking off the court after losing to the Bulls, he brought up and reminded everybody about how Bird and those guys had walked off the court even though he stopped McHale and they shook hands before parting ways. Talking about that was just the times we were living in. When you saw all of that noise about Isaiah and the Chicago Bulls and them walking off, and then you heard or was reminded of how Boston did the same when they had lost to the Detroit Pistons. What went through your mind reflecting on it as a Boston Celtics fan?
I like how Stephen A immediately comes in with the Boston slander. I knew that was going to happen. I should have been prepared. Look, it's been debunked. In the 80s, if you were on the road, the fans went on the court. And, especially in Detroit, they really went on the court. And the security came over to the bench. First of all, if you go, the whole game's on YouTube. If you go and look at it, they think the game's over, and then it's not. They're shooting free throws. And fans are, really close. And this really went all the way through the 1988 season. They had to get out of there for security reasons. This happened over and over again over the course of that decade. When it changed was 1988 Finals Game 7 Detroit Lakers, where if you go and you watch the end of that game, Detroit's down 3 in the final 5 seconds. The Laker fans are about to rush on the court. They start rushing on the court. Detroit had a chance to tie the game. And I think after that, that's when you saw the security guards, things like that. But it was just more unsafe in the 80s. I think the 91 Pistons, the difference with what they did, it was a home game. Nobody was rushing the court. There was no security reason for them to leave. They just wanted to be jerks. And they wanted to deprive the Bulls of the handshake thing. And it stunk at the time. It tainted them for a while. And then I wasn't surprised that it came back in 2020.
Bill, I want to get back to your Muhammad Ali analogy. Maybe not surprising.
I knew you'd like that, Max.
It's an excellent one. Yeah, there's no perfect analogy because but it's a really good one. The difference between the prime physical Jordan and the wiser, maybe not tougher, but more resourceful Jordan in the second three. But when you look at the opponents Jordan beat, especially in the second three-peat, and he had incredible teammates, Rodman and Kukoc and these guys. When you look at those opponents, he swept a 60-win Shaq Penny team on the way to beating teams like, forget about Portland for a second, it was really, a great team, but the Sonics won 64 games. They beat the Rockets, who were back-to-back champions. They beat the Jazz, who are about to go to 2 finals, on the way to getting, beaten relatively easily by the Bulls. The Utah Jazz had 3 great players, not just Stockton and Malone, but Hornacek, a great coach. Ali had these great opponents where he was the underdog in the second half of his career. Jordan, because of his dominance, still led the league in scoring all the time, put up the best stats, was never perceived as the underdog. How do you rate the competition he faced in the second half? You know, because people talk about, well, the Celtics and the Lakers had each other, and the Pistons were older by this point. How do you rate the opponents Jordan beat in the second half of his career?
I think the first three-peat, you look at how deep the league was at the time when it hadn't been murdered by expansion yet, and it makes it more impressive. I think the league from 1990 to 93 was so loaded. And you even look at the All-NBA teams. You're talking about Hall of Famers across the board, first team, second team, even some on the third team. By the time we got to the mid-90s, they had added 4 expansion teams over the course of that decade. They were up to 29 teams. And honestly, I think that was one of the reasons Jordan came back. And if you read the Jordan books, he started looking at the league, how diluted it was, thinking to himself, wow, I could come back and steal a couple more titles. Like, he told B.J. Armstrong this. So, I think it was an easier run, no question, the second time. The best way to look at this is look at the Utah Jazz. That was a team that, when you go through the 1988 through basically 95, 96, could never get over the hump, would fall short over and over again with Malone and Stockton as their 2 best guys. By the time they got to the finals in 97 and 98, the third best guy was Hornacek, who was at the tail end of his prime. Other than that, a bunch of role players. It was not a better Jazz team than what they had from 88 to 92. They won 64 games in 1997. It makes no sense because Malone and Stockton at that point had already played 1,000 games. So I think the league was definitely watered down. I think it was one of the reasons they won 72 and 69 in back-to-back years, the Bulls. And if you go back and read what people were writing at the time, they were saying it was watered down.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming, sports, and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.